This is Tia Graham reporting for the Real News Network. One of the most stunning contrasts to emerge during last year's uprising was the so-called Tale of Two Cities, the stark difference seen around the world between Baltimore's gleaming Inner Harbor and the neighborhood where Freddie Gray was arrested. At the root of this disparity is something that doesn't always operate in plain sight: tax breaks for developers. The city has granted hundreds of millions for neighborhoods like Harbor East and the Inner Harbor, and very few, if any, in poor Black neighborhoods. And now, just a year later, Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank is asking for the biggest tax break in the history of the city: $500 million to build a veritable mini-city called Port Covington. But it's not just the amount, but what's in the details some say reveals just how the city manufactures inequity. To help us break down what this means and how big tax breaks and poverty reinforce one another are two people who know much about both. Jeff Singer is the founder of Healthcare for the Homeless and an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Stephen Janis is an Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter for The Real News. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Stephen, let me start with you.
Okay.
What kind of tax break is Plank looking for?
Well, this is what some people have called mega TIFs or super TIFs. He wants roughly $535 or $540 million of basically a tax break that will allow the project, which is Port Covington, not to pay property taxes for 20 or 30 years. So that money he wants to build supposedly infrastructure or whatever, but basically it's $500,000. But the thing that's not known about these kind of tax breaks is that they are financed through bonds. And the city basically borrows money to give to the developer, and the developer pays off the bonds with what would be the property tax, which means this TIF could be, upwards of $1.2, $1.3 billion. So it is a massive TIF. I mean, if you look at the city's property tax collections, the city collects about $850 million, I think in the fiscal year 2015, in property tax, somewhere around there. This is a year and a half of the city's property taxes, completely dedicated to a project. And bear in mind that during that period of time, the 20 or 30 years before the TIF runs out, the city will be providing services to this veritable mini-city, as you said on the Hill. They will be providing police, sewer, everything. And the city taxpayers will have to compensate for that loss of revenue. So it is a massive TIF on a scale that's unprecedented in the city.
Okay. Jeff, you were at the Board of Estimates meeting when the city gave an exemption to the inclusionary housing law. Could you explain what this is?
I'll try.
Okay, thank you.
It's pretty darn complicated. It's true that the developer has asked for a TIF, tax increment financing, of about $535 million or so, and the cost of that is much, much more. In addition, he's asked for a subsidy from the federal and state governments of $574 million. So the total of all this might be $1.5 billion of our money that's going to a guy who's a billionaire.
Incredible.
He's a billionaire. According to Forbes this year, he's worth $2.1 billion, and other sources say $4 billion. And we'll get to the details of that later because it's very important. In any event, his people and the city and the BDC, the Baltimore Development Corporation, sat down behind closed doors and made a deal. And the deal is that he will get his bonds, at least $535 million worth of bonds, and he will not have to follow the rules of Baltimore's inclusionary housing ordinance.
So can you tell us what an exemption to this actually means, like in profitability for Kevin Plank?
Well, it's hard to say that because all of this is done in secret and none of the documents have yet been revealed. We had the same problem 2 years ago with Harbor Point. The difference, Harbor Point was a smaller project. The developer, Michael Beatty, asked for a $107 million TIF, so it's a fifth the size approximately, and he got it. Now we know that Michael Beatty was estimating that he would earn a 10% profit on his development without this subsidy. He wanted a 14% profit, and the city said, fine, we will help you, assure you and your investors get a 14% profit. We don't have yet the numbers for Port Covington, but I'm sure they're going to be extraordinary.
Okay. So this isn't the only super TIF that we've seen. And as Jeff mentioned, 2 years ago, they offered quite a bit of money to Michael Beatty.
Yeah.
Can you tell me some of the things that the city did to actually facilitate this?
Well, I mean, Jeff brings up one of the biggest points about this entire process, which is completely hidden from the public until it gets up to the council. Basically, much like the Port Covington TIF, the BDC, the Baltimore Development Corporation, first meets in secret and negotiates the terms of the TIF in secret. And then when I was covering it in 2013 or 14, it went to what's called the Finance Board, and they kicked us out. They kicked us out because
Really?
And all we wanted to do was observe the deliberations of the board on how to spend $100 million in taxpayer money, which is an amazing thing. So we filed an Open Meetings Act complaint, and we won, but of course it was too late. And so by the time it gets to the council, it's already a done deal. And if you read sort of the TIF details, like in the Beatty TIF and the TIF for most recently we'll talk about later, you will see that it's basically a one-sided argument. The developer is able to hire a consultant who does a but-for analysis, which is just, what would happen if we don't have the TIF? And nobody changes it. I mean, I've never seen in my history as a reporter anything change from the BDC level that we know about to the council. No one says, hey, Mr. Beatty or Mr. Plank, could you do with maybe 400 million? Or how about 80 million? Would that be okay? Because we really can't afford it. And now, one of the things about this TIF that there is question about, the city can only borrow up to 4% of its entire tax base. And this TIF could push it over and thus hurt our credit rating. And secondly, of course, as Jeff knows, we're already, we already have lost some school funding because our real estate assessed value has gone up tremendously, but that we're not collecting money from it. So it is a really, really bad deal in some ways.
Jeff, I have to ask, why does the poorest jurisdiction in the state continue to give huge amounts of money to the richest developers? And does this make poverty worse in Baltimore?
Oh, sure it does, because it means that whatever meager resources the city has, they're not using to help the poor neighborhoods. Of all the TIFs that we have records of, there's approximately a 7-to-1 ratio of $7 going to a rich person versus $1 going to a neighborhood that's poor, even though the people getting the money aren't poor, right? So we know it to the extent we know that's what we found. But Stephen has raised so many interesting issues in his commentary here. One of them is that at the Board of Estimates meeting, the BDC testified briefly, but provided no information. The president of the BDC, Bill Cole, was called upon to testify. But there was no information released by anyone, from Paul Graziano, the housing commissioner, to Bill Cole, the BDC director, to the mayor, the city's solicitor, George Nielsen. They all spoke briefly, just saying, this is a great thing for the city. We can't give you the details yet, but we're going to adopt it anyway. And the city council president, Jack Young, and the controller, Joan Pratt, said, well, that's not quite fair. We haven't had time to review this. But in fact, no one's had time to review it. So that's one set of issues. Another one is that the losses of tax dollars to the city, this became an issue during the Harbor Point discussions. The former city director of planning, who was also the former state director of planning, Ron Kreitner, who, by the way, is one of the few public officials I've ever worked with who seems to have a high integrity and be intelligent. But Ron Kreitner testified to the city council that if they gave Michael Beatty this TIF, they were going to exacerbate the loss of state funding for the school system. The city and the school system insisted that he didn't know what he was talking about.
I remember that.
Right? They even brought in a school system finance expert to say that's absolutely false. 2 years later, we see the city going to the legislature and crying because they lost $40 million in state funds simply because of the TIFs they've been giving out.
That's incredible. That is absolutely incredible. And just to be clear, when I drive around the city, I've noticed more homeless people on the street, and I've noticed a greater racial diversity of homeless people on the street, as one way to put it. Could you tell me something about why we're seeing so many more homeless, so many more displaced people?
That's an important and complicated question, and I don't have an empirical answer to it. But we do know that the distinction between incomes and housing has been growing dramatically for the last 40 years, right? We had a crash not too many years ago that both pointed this out and exacerbated it. We know that in Baltimore there are 150,000 eviction notices issued every year, right? Which is more than one per poor household.
Yeah, we have the highest rate of eviction, I think, in the
Probably in the world, we
Yeah.
have the highest
In the
rate
world.
of eviction.
It's possible.
So one of the issues here is a class issue. Poor people can't afford housing. The city does almost nothing to create affordable housing. This is being highlighted in this TIF.
Yes.
We have an inclusionary housing law. I don't know if you want me to talk about
No,
this now. but
please, absolutely.
We struggled for years to create an inclusionary housing law. What's that? Well, when a wealthy developer builds a residential project, if it has 30 units or more, 20% of the units are supposed to be set aside for poorer people. Not necessarily poor people. There are levels of income. If your income is below 30% of the area median income, which is now about $88,000, 30% of that is about $25,000, then 20% of the units are set aside for all the lower income people, and 30% of that 20%, i.e. 6% of the units, are set aside for the poorest Baltimoreans. 6% of the units. Now, the Port Covington project claims to be building 7,500 units. If they were required to follow the law, 6% of the 7,500 units would be set aside for the poorest people in Baltimore. In their negotiations between the city and Kevin Plank, the city agreed to alleviate Kevin Plank from building any units for the poorest Baltimoreans.
How could the mayor allow him that exemption? How could they allow such an obvious violation of the spirit of the law?
Well, because it's not probably a violation of the letter of the law, because the way the law was written was certainly in the favor of developers. The developers provide financial information to the city. Based on what the developers provide, the city does a calculation about affordability. Not affordability for the poor folks in Baltimore who need housing. Oh no, affordability for the developer.
I see.
And remember, the person who wrote the letter giving them exemption is the famous Paul Graziano, who has certainly, many people have called
Yes.
for him to resign. So yeah, that is it's amazing that the city, the taxes that come from the poor people in the city are actually going to subsidize this, and they're being excluded. It's amazing.
So, Jeff, what do you think is next for the Port Covington TIF?
It's going to the Board of Finance on Monday at 3 p.m., so that might be interesting. But beyond that, they will then go to City Council, and the city's Housing Committee and the city's Finance Committee will take it up. Who knows what will happen, but I do know that many of us are organizing around it. We were unable to, of course, defeat the TIF for Harbor Point. Will we have more success? I doubt it. In fact, I think it's going to be worse because everyone is lining up to get on the gravy train of Port
Sure.
Covington. It's a $5 billion project.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's going to be very little resistance to this.
Now, can
Especially
we?
with an outgoing mayor who really, she wants to, have one more big project before she leaves. I mean, there's no one who's going. The mayor right now is not going to have to live with the consequences.
Very true. So we're finishing up an investigation on a smaller TIF for the University of Maryland Biotech Park. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it's a $17.5 million deal, which seems meager in comparison to some of the TIFs we're talking about. But it's really interesting and revealing because it sort of tells a story about how TIFs, how they try to sell TIFs to people and how what happens behind closed doors is extremely different. A lot of times they'll make the argument, this is for infrastructure, this is for building out roads or whatever. But in this case, with this TIF for the $17.5 million for the biotech park, it actually is building out office space. It actually is building office space for an incubator company from Massachusetts who does sort of medical incubators for firms that are sort of startups. So it's $17.5 million to build leasehold improvements, not sidewalks, not roads, and not infrastructure, even though I really think that argument is specious to begin with. And if you look at some of the numbers, for example, they're only anticipating that 30% of the people who live there who work there will live in the city. So the whole job thing, we're going to create 1,000 jobs, only 30% of those are going to the people who actually live in the city. And on top of that, while TIFs usually require this 12 to 1, $12 of investment for $1 of TIF value, this particular project got through with no problem with $5 to 1 ratio. So, 40 or 30% of what they normally expect. So, this TIF, while minor, shows that this really isn't about infrastructure. It really isn't about bringing jobs into the city. I mean, for $500 million in Plank's case, we could just build a factory, right, and just give people jobs. It probably lasts for a couple of years, But I think it's small. But on the other hand, it's very illustrative that this money really goes to benefit the developer and brings back very little to the community who actually pay the taxes to support it.
Very true. Very true.
If I might add to
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
this TIF, this University of Maryland Biopark TIF, is one that needs a lot more examination. And part of the issue is that the company that they're giving the money to is actually owned by another company. It's owned by a company called Blackstone, a company
Yep.
that has $40 billion
that's very true.
of assets, a company whose CEO earned $282 million last year. So he could, out of the lint in his pocket, pay for this entire project.
Right.
The citizens of Baltimore don't need to pay for any of it.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. I want to thank my guests, Stephen Janis and Jeff Singer, for joining me. This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network.